It was on the staircase that I decided I really might be facing a problem. I had the first inkling that there might be a problem that morning at breakfast. I was having breakfast, some leftover black bean, quinoa, squash bowl, rehydrated over my camp stove in Deer Creek Canyon, which is what Palisade Creek flows through. I was at about 9,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada in the forest next to the creek, and I was eating breakfast, and I was eating the leftovers of the meal from the night before, because the night before I hadn't felt quite right, and I hadn't been able to finish my whole camp meal. These dehydrated camping meals that come in a bag, they're kind of big, and I'd been like grumbling about how big they were the whole trip. But this one I couldn't quite finish, so I saved it for breakfast the next day, and the next day I just didn't feel quite right having that and some of my oatmeal. But I got going, and I headed up the staircase. The staircase in question, it's this section of the John Muir Trail called the Golden Staircase. It goes about 1,500 feet up steep switchbacks from Deer Canyon, which is about 9,000, and it ends at a plateau at about 10,500 feet, where the trees have run out and it's just rocks and a couple lakes, Palisade Lakes, and the headwaters of Palisade Creek. And then a few miles beyond that was the pass I was headed toward. It's Mather Pass, which is a 12,100 foot pass. I was having trouble on the staircase. It's steep. It's steep switchbacks. I was tired. The altitude, I don't know if I would say it was really getting to me, but everything in the thin air is a little harder. So if you can imagine, Denver is at 5,000 feet, and a lot of people complain about the air being thin in Denver. And I was, between 9 and 10,000 feet, so every step was a struggle. And I was carrying a pretty heavy pack. I mean, I'd done my best to lighten it as I was getting ready for this trip, but it's still a pretty solid 40 pounds. And I'm struggling up the staircase, and I'm thinking, I'm really needing to rest too often. And maybe every minute or so I would come to a rock and I'd say, "You look like a good rock," because this was the 10th day I was by myself in the wilderness, and I was talking to rocks and trees and marmots and pika and chipmunks and grasshoppers, just to hear the sound of a voice. I mean, I did run into people maybe once or twice a day, but there was very little human interaction. I was on this trek because last year I got separated. And a month or so after I got separated, I got this idea that I wanted to go traveling. And then I got this idea in my head further that I wanted to do something epically cool to prove to myself that I was still a cool, strong, badass kind of guy, even though I was not feeling so hot about myself as a result of the separation. So I applied for a permit to hike the John Muir Trail, which is a 210-mile trail that goes from Yosemite National Park to Mount Whitney in the south. It goes through the Sierra Nevada in California. It starts about 4,000 feet in Yosemite Valley, an altitude where a guide friend of mine told me, that's where you start experiencing altitude symptoms, and you don't sleep quite right. There and above, you never sleep quite right. You'll be a little tired, and it'll just get harder the further up you go. So it starts about 4,000 and very quickly goes up to 8,000, and then the whole rest of the way south, it just keeps getting higher until you get to Mount Whitney, which is about 14,500 feet. It's the highest peak in the lower 48, and that was my goal. Was to get from Yosemite to Mount Whitney, to prove to myself I was a tough guy. In that 40-pound pack, I had brought with me 2 50-milliliter bottles of single malt scotch. I had, in honor of Scottish naturalist John Muir, for whom the trail is named, founder of the Sierra Club. I had drunk the 15-year-old scotch in Yosemite Valley, and my intention was to get to the top of Mount Whitney and drink the 20-year-old scotch out of my titanium camping mug, chilled with Sierra snowpack if I could find any handy. So I was on day 10, and one of the problems I was dealing with, the biggest problem I was dealing with was I had just decided to go on this backpacking trip 6 months before, and I had never been camping since I was 13, and that was just one night at summer camp. So I had to learn a lot in a short time, and I was also an overweight, middle-aged man. Ironically, I picked this as my midlife crisis because it seemed to me buying a motorcycle would be reckless. So I'm on the staircase, I'm struggling up, and I'm having a harder time than I think I should, but there was really no choice but to go forward. This was approximately 155 miles into the trail. I have a lot left to go. Even though it's the morning of day 10, I had only allowed myself 12 days to do this whole trail because of my work schedule. Basically, I wanted more than that, but my manager didn't see it that way. So I had to get back, and that meant I had to do a lot of miles every day, a lot of miles through the mountains at high altitude, which is not really something I could train for here. The highest thing you can get to around here is about 4,000 feet out in Shenandoah, and I had been out there many times, but it's not the same. So every day I would do the math, like how far have I gone, how much do I have left to go. The morning of the 10th day, I figured I still had to go 23 miles a day to get to Mount Whitney on time, and then I would need to hike from Mount Whitney 10 miles downhill to the trailhead, probably in the dark, and hitchhike into town, but that was fine. Like hell or high water, I was doing this. I was doing this thing which, you know, my parents were afraid I was going to get eaten by bears. Various people had expressed a little bit of doubt as to whether this was a good idea. But I was determined I was going to do this, and even though the distance kept getting long, that I had to go each day kept getting longer, I was optimistic I could do it because I kept getting stronger and my pack kept getting lighter, and even though the top speed I had managed so far was 18 miles a day, I was sure that I could just press on through sheer force of will and get down to Mount Whitney. But on the staircase, I was starting to reconsider this. I got to the top of the staircase, and I'm at this plateau, the Palisade Lakes Plateau, and it's about 10,500 feet, and I feel awful. I feel nauseous, I feel weak. All I want to do is lay down, but there is really nowhere to rest because one of the things about the Sierra, in addition to the altitude, is there's almost no clouds. During the hiking season in the summer and late summer, it rains maybe once or twice a month, and most of the time there's almost no perceptible clouds. So the sun just beats down on you, and then you get into the shade and you're cold because the air is so thin and dry. But I wanted shade, and I wanted that cold, dry air because I was hot and weak and felt crappy. So I could see ahead of me the lakes that I was expecting, and I could see next to one of them there was a stand of trees. So I just made myself go as fast as I could to the stand of trees. And when I got there, I found a pine tree that had a big bed of pine needles underneath it, and I threw down my pack, and I didn't care if some marmots tore open the side pockets and ate all my Snickers. I just needed to lay down. So I laid down on this bed of pine needles, and I just fell asleep for an hour. And I figured everything will be fine. Like maybe I'll feel better when I wake up, and I'll be able to keep going. So I wake up an hour later, and I don't feel worse, but I don't feel better. So I'm thinking about my options, and what I have left to do that day, the main thing I wanted to do that day was get up and over this 12,000 foot pass, because once I got into the downhill, I know that's a lot easier. Like I can do that fairly quickly, even with the altitude and the rough ground, like I can go down pretty easily. And I'm thinking about my options, like, well, I don't think I can. I think maybe I'll rest a few more hours, just a few more hours, then I'll see how I'm doing, and maybe near sunset I can get over the pass. And I pull out what is my single most expensive gear, the one thing that, I was going to say it gave me the confidence to hike solo, but really it gave my parents the confidence to let me hike solo. It's a Garmin InReach. It's a GPS device that is also a messenger that can send text messages over the Iridium satellite phone network. So if anywhere in the world you can send text messages. And I've got this thing going my whole hike so that my parents can go to a website and see about every 15 minutes what my position is. And once a day I'm sending a message saying, yeah, I'm okay, starting for the day, here I am. I get this out and laboriously type out a message indicating that I actually don't feel so hot, and I'm taking some time to rest, but nobody call rescue. I'm okay, just taking some time to rest. I'm going to figure out what to do. And of course, what I'm actually doing is looking at the button on the side of the communicator. And it's covered, there's a button that's covered by a cover, like you're going to launch a nuclear weapon, because you really don't want to press it accidentally. It's the SOS button. And if you press that button and then don't have any further communication, very soon a helicopter will be coming to exactly where you are. And it was kind of a point of pride to me that I not need that rescue. Also, I didn't really want to impose. I didn't want to impose on the park rangers or the sheriff's department to fly their helicopter out into the mountains. And I definitely didn't want to have a bunch of people risking their own safety hiking or riding mules out onto the trail to come get me. So I'm pretty determined that, like, well, whatever is going to happen, I have to walk out myself. So I'm thinking about my options. And of course I still want to finish, but I'm not sure. And I look at my guidebooks for a little while and try to figure out what to do. And eventually I decide that, like, I just can't figure this out right now. Because I've put so much of myself into this. This has really been like the last 6 months of my life. My overriding concern, above all other things, is get ready for this hike. Get fit, get trained, weekend-long wilderness first aid class, 2 days of map and compass navigation, backcountry skills galore, buying gear, because I want to do this thing to prove to myself that I can. And I don't really want to face up to the fact that, like, I'm on the verge of failing at the one thing that I've spent the last 6 months on. I mean, I'd also spent the last 6 months getting divorced, but that just kind of like moved along pretty easily in the background. This is the thing that I actually cared about. So I decide I'll take a nap for a few hours, and when I set up my tent to get a shelter from the sun, and a couple times while I was napping, I could hear the crunch of feet going by on the trail, and I could actually, out from under the rainfly of my tent, I could see feet walking by, and I kind of wanted to say something to them, but I just didn't quite have the strength to speak up out of my half-awake state. And I eventually wake up, and it's close to dinner time, and I don't even feel strong enough to eat. Like, I don't want to get out of my sleeping bag, I don't want to boil water, I don't want to rehydrate anything. Like, I just slowly chew on a Snickers and go back to sleep. And I slept the whole night there in that spot. And the next morning, I woke up, and now it's the morning of the 11th day, and there's really no option. Like, I'm lying to myself if I think there's any chance that I'm gonna walk another 60 plus miles in 2 days. 2 days is not only the amount of time I have left, it's also the amount of food I have left, so I can't just show up late. So I start looking at what my options are, and I look at my maps and my guidebooks, and I can go backwards about 10 miles to a trail junction, and another 10 miles to a 12,000 foot pass, and then down some more miles to a trailhead that's still in the wilderness, and I will be lucky if I can find someone to hitchhike from. And it kind of rubs me the wrong way to go backwards after I've gone this distance. Of course, going backwards would be the medically sensible thing to do, because I've also been trying to decide what's wrong with me. Not being a doctor, but with my 2 days of wilderness first aid training, I'm trying to figure out, like, do I have altitude sickness? Do I have food poisoning? Am I just exhausted? Because like a dumbass, I've been hiking 18 miles a day in the mountains with a 40-pound pack on, and I'm 45 and overweight. I don't know which it is. If it's altitude sickness, it'll get worse if I go up. The only thing you can do to treat altitude sickness is to go down. But forward is up. And that's the direction I want to go. And so ultimately I decide, looking at my symptoms, like, it's probably not altitude sickness. And if it is, I'll try to go up. And if I have to, I'll go down. And if I get up and over the hump, then I'll be going down. And I'm sure it won't lead to cerebral edema, so I'll be fine. And so I get up, and that morning I head towards Mather Pass, and it's a pretty long slog for just a few miles and up 1,000 feet or so. And I'm going up the switchbacks on Mather Pass, appreciating one of the other mistakes I made getting ready for this journey was underestimating mules. The John Muir Trail was built around the turn of the 20th century and conceived as a trail from Yosemite to Mount Whitney that was passable not just for people but for livestock. And it's still used for that purpose now. Most of the trail is at least 10 miles from a paved road. So all the rangers that work in that area, the construction crews that work on the trails, the backcountry resorts, they're all supplied by mule trains. And this is super obvious on the trail, especially near Yosemite Valley where there's a lot of traffic. Basically, any stone step looks like it's covered with a bright green Berber carpet of mule droppings, which you just have to get accustomed to walking on, because apparently going uphill has a laxative effect on mules. And then later on in the trail, you get to appreciate it, because you'll get to places where, a lot of the trail is basically like a trench cut in the dirt. You can't miss it. But then there are other places that are just bare rock, and you can't tell where you're supposed to go. But if you just stop and look around in a circle, eventually you will spot a pile of mule poop. And that's where the trail is, because the mules know where to go. And so you keep going. But I had really underestimated, I had read this about the trail being constructed for mules, and thought that it can't be so bad. I mean, if only people can scramble up it, it could be really treacherous. But if it's big enough for mules to go up it, it can't be that bad. So I have a newfound appreciation for how agile and strong mules are as I'm slogging my way up to the 12,000-foot pass. I do eventually get to the top, and I'm rewarded with a beautiful view down the upper basin of the South Fork Kings River. And I know from my guidebooks, I've got a fairly gentle 7 miles downhill to where I have to cross the Kings River. And then there's an uphill, but that 7 miles downhill, it's fairly sharp at the beginning, but then it's a long, long, gentle downhill. And that I just cruise along, and I'm feeling better, a little bit lower altitude, feeling better to make forward progress. I feel bad about giving up on my dream of going to Mount Whitney and drinking scotch at the top, but I've got a renewed sense of purpose, which is I want to go home, alive, on my own feet. I cruise down to the Kings River, cross it, run into a couple of Pacific Crest Trail through hikers, have lunch with them. I don't mention that I'm in trouble because I'm feeling pretty good at this point. I got my escape plan. I've identified the side trail I'm going to go up that my guidebook only has a short write-up on, but it describes it as like a gentle climb up and reasonably well maintained, even though it's not very well used. I go up some switchbacks from the Kings River, find the trail intersection, and I almost cry a little bit when I see the sign that says Taboose Pass this way. And I know I'm leaving the John Muir Trail, and I don't know if I will be able to come back and finish my goal. But I get off on the Taboose Pass trail, and it's a few miles up to Taboose Pass, which is another 11,000-foot pass. Actually, it's 11,400. And it's beautiful. It's like Scottish Highlands, like broad green plains. Beautiful. When I get to the top of the pass, which unfortunately was about sunset, I can hear a dog barking in the distance, and I know there's no native wolves living up at 12,000 feet, so I know somebody else is up there camping. And it's beautiful, and normally on my trek, basically, I didn't try to continue much after sunset, or if I was coming to a really high place, I'd try to stop just before it, sleep there, and then tackle the rise with fresh legs in the morning. But I'm pretty eager to get off the trail, so I decided to go over the hump, over the pass, and go down as much as I can so I can get a head start getting out on the Taboose Creek Trail. Unfortunately, I get over the top, and what looks like the Scottish Highlands turns into Tatooine, or Mars. There's nothing but bare rock. There's a couple little streams here and there, but it's all bare, loose rock. And the sun's going down, and I keep going a little bit, but then I get to this section which the guidebook hadn't really mentioned, which is that going down from the pass, it's about 3,000 feet down, it's nothing but switchbacks on talus slope. Now, if you don't know what talus is, it's something you really only run into in the West. It's where a bare rock mountain is crumbling and produces a slope of boulders from fist size to car size. Sometimes they're stable to walk on, sometimes they roll underfoot. Sometimes it's just the only place to go, so a path or trail will be built on that by sort of leveling out the rocks. Well, I didn't realize I had to go down quite a distance on this talus slope, and I didn't really have any time to wait, so I just turned on my headlamp and kept going in the dark. And I kept going down those switchbacks on that talus slope, and even though in the previous 10 days on the trail I had never fallen a single time, on that downhill, feeling weak and exhausted and scared, I fell 5 times on that slope. And then I got to a point where my headlight didn't reach anything I could recognize as the trail. I'm just on a big rocky slope, and the light's running out over here, the light's running out over here. When I turn this way, I think there's a big drop off over there based on my topo map, but I'm not entirely sure because I can't see it. I think there's a big drop off over there. I can't really see a trail. Like, I know behind me was a trail, I think, but I can't see where it's supposed to go. And I have this, and there's also no surface big enough for me to even sit down, much less lie down, put down a sleeping bag, sleep. And I actually start crying because I am so tired and I don't know if this is gonna be it for me. And I'm also scared because I don't know which direction to go, and there's a drop off over there. I know there's a drop off over there, but if I go the wrong direction and slip, I could go tumbling down this talus slope. And I have an SOS beacon, but that's not much good if my arms are broken or if I'm unconscious, and this is a not very used trail. So maybe no one will come find me for days if I get hurt. And I'm looking around and I'm tearing up, thinking like, I have no idea what I'm gonna do now, trying to find the trail in the light of my headlamp, and I spot something wedged in the rocks over to my right. Mule poop. And I know that's the way home. I basically draw a bead between where I know the last bit of trail was and the mule poop, and I start going that way, and just beyond the mule poop, the trail becomes clear again. Clear and obvious. So I keep headed downhill. I do eventually get to a spot next to a stream that's big and flat enough to pitch my tent for the night. The next morning I get up and I head down the remaining 4,000 feet of descent down the steep canyon down to the trailhead for the Taboose Creek Pass. At the trailhead, there's one car parked, presumably the owner of the dog I heard the night before, and I can get close enough to the creek to get water, which is good because at that point I was out, and the thermometer on the little emergency whistle on my pack said it was 100 degrees, and I had another 6-mile walk to go before I would get to the highway where I could definitely hitchhike back to a town. Ironically, as a Northern Virginian, my savior was going to be $3.95. So I filtered about 4 liters of water, drank as much as I could, filled up my pack, and I started heading down the dirt road. I did eventually get back to town, and I get back to town on the 12th day when I was supposed to, and I did catch my 4-hour-long bus ride back to LA so I could get the flight home to be back in time so I could be at work, sitting in my office on the last day of the government fiscal year as my boss insisted. And just a few weeks ago I got my permit to go back and climb up the Taboose Creek Pass Trail, entering exactly where I left from the JMT, and 8 days later exiting Whitney Portal, the trailhead next to Mount Whitney. So I'll be climbing up that pass in late August, and 8 days later I'll be drinking scotch on top of Mount Whitney. Thank you.